So thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks for the invitation to come and talk here to you. It's really a pleasure to present my research. So this presentation really focuses on some key results from my PhD research, which looks at the relationship and networks of creative industries in the northeast of England, in the area of Newcastle. I focused the presentation on the network aspect of my research just because I thought that connected more with the rest of the papers, but there are quite a few other dimensions to it in terms of regeneration, creative work, and other artistic practice, which I don't touch in this presentation, but if you want to discuss those topics further, talk with me, or I can send you some papers, some references if you're interested in that. So specifically today I'm going to talk about the relational perspective to the creative city, and how mapping networks enables us to discover connection between public, private, and not-for-profit sector in the creative industries. So first, in terms of an overview to my talk, I'm going to talk very briefly about the literature in terms of how the literature has evolved around creative industries, both in terms of changing definitions of what creative industries are, but also in terms of changing understanding from what is the production system perspective to the one of a knowledge pool and a network of connections. I'm going to then specifically highlight my methodology, and sort of I will discuss also towards the conclusion about the sort of aspect of the methodology which I found more challenging, which I think is important to reflect on. And then the core of the presentation really will focus on the networks and analyzing the ideas of clustering and collaboration, but also overlapping these sort of physical and clustering collaboration to the social fabric of the city, so looking at social dynamic amongst creative practitioners. And specifically I want to look at what networks are for, so different characteristics and different ways in which networks are used by creative practitioners, and distinguish between formal and informal networks, which seems to be something quite important for practitioners themselves, and then, as I say, focus on public, private, and not-for-profit. And hopefully the conclusions will have convinced you by then that we really need to adopt this relational perspective to understand the creative city. So briefly about definitions, there probably are hundreds of definitions of the creative industry, creative economy, creative city. When I started my research, I specifically focused on the definition provided by the DCMS, which is the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in the UK. And so obviously I adopted this definition not because it's the greatest definition of all, but mainly because it provided a policy framework for my research. So I had to really adapt to the policy framework to understand what creative industries were in that specific context. But the limit, if you want, to this definition, and also the sort of flexibility of it, is that it really focuses on individual creativity, skill, and talent, rather than the business structure of the creative industries themselves. So what that means is that I didn't need to think about what is the business structure and the definition of that, but simply think about who are the individuals involved in the creative economy. You come? Oh. Yeah. But what I was really interested in was very much trying to understand how the creative and cultural industries have always been understood in a very sort of polarized way. On one side, you have the public arts, and they're not called creative industry, they're called usually public arts institution and organization. And on the other, you've got the more industrial sort of cultural production, media, music, that are more adapted to a sort of industrial system of production. But in a sort of ways, although we tend to have that sort of distinction in our head, I wanted to really try and see how much there was a continuum between the two, how much it was hard to really put boundaries on where the arts and where the creative industry started, and what kind of different definition people were adopting. So although I started with a clear definition in policy term, I was very open to extend that, to try and understand very broadly how the sector worked, rather than simply applying my own definition to it. So in terms of the literature, I wanted to also highlight the sort of change that has taken place from when we started talking about creative industries, and Andy Pratt really was one of the first to look at the creative industry production system. And at the really beginning, there was this idea that you could separate almost where the idea were created, where they were put into a production system, where they were reproduced, what kind of media, and how they were exchanged. So as if these were different stages taking places in different places and also with different people in a sort of consequential way. And from that initial understanding, which obviously was useful to map and understand the question, we got a sort of evolution of thinking about creative industry, which is much more based on the idea of the sector and networks that really apply to the sector. So what we now look at is not just a simple sort of production system, but more a sort of connection which are part of the production chain in the creative industries. And we really want to talk about the role of the networks as being the one that connects all those stages of production and brings them together. So when I started my PhD research, very early on in my literature review, I met this knowledge pool model, and I thought it was really interesting because I really captured what I really wanted to discover. So this was a theoretical model, so it wasn't based on a field work or any research, but it was very much sort of try to point out how the creative individual is connected to a series of organizations, institutions, places, projects, that sort of create a network within a specific geographical context. And the idea is very much that all of these key actors have got a set of knowledge, skills, and opportunities that they bring together in this network. And when I came across this, it was very much a sort of an abstract model. And what I really aimed to do in my PhD is, could I get some data that could give us that view, but with the real data rather than being a model. And obviously, as things happen, it's much more complicated than you think in the model, so it's much more messy than you would want it to be. But this sort of very much gives you the idea that although it's very hard to get to the model to really capture those sort of key dynamics, it is true that there is that series of connection and connection that happen between people and places and people and organizations. So I will go obviously in more detail to explain this, but I just wanted to point out that the use of the social network analysis is not just a sort of fancy tool that it gives you interesting map. It's really moved by this idea that you can actually capture those networks and those connections that are happening in real life and not just assume that they are there. So now I'm going to move a little bit on my methodology. I think obviously we could talk half an hour only about the methodology, but I don't want to bother you too much. But when I started, I very much wanted to adopt an ethnographic and qualitative approach. So I was never a quantitative researcher, and I really spent 2 years in Newcastle Gates and then, meeting people, taking coffees and teas and beers to try and get into those networks and talk with the people that were involved in the creative industries there. But as I showed you before, then I came across social network analysis as a way of trying to capture those relationships and map them in a much more scientific way that an ethnography study could do. So I ended up doing 136 interviews because I didn't know when to stop. And that's one of the problems with the networks, defining those boundaries. When are you going to stop? Because the networks never stops. So, and that's so I started with interviews. In my methodology, I had a very, very tricky social network analysis questionnaire. Again, I wasn't very experienced, so it was a huge questionnaire I gave to people. And I was so, obviously, I knew it would have been hard to just send the questionnaire and ask people to fill it in, so I had to convince them. So I had to always meet them, tell them about the questionnaire, really tell them how important it was, so convince them really that they were to buy into my research to give me those personal data. So that's why also the number of interviews is very high, because I was sure if I had posted the questionnaire via email, nobody would have replied to it. But instead, with 136 interviews, trying to convince and explain how important the questionnaire was to complete my research, I got 90 questionnaires back, which is a really big number considering the size of my questionnaire. So that's really, a challenging thing. But as I said, it was, and this I think is something that is common to a lot of social network analysis research done in the field. You really need to get your people, the people you're going to investigate and research about on board. They really need to understand what you want to do, and you really need to share those goals and those objectives and those, questionnaires to be able to get them back. So I met all these people, and I gave them a paper questionnaire, but I asked them to take their time, fill in the questionnaire, and return it to me afterwards. So that's how I went through the process. I probably could have asked, and I did for one or two, to complete the questionnaire there, but I really wanted people to use the questionnaire to reflect on their contacts, that they simply give me some names there on the spot. And I think that was also quite important, because a lot of people gave me feedback after they returned the questionnaire, saying they really helped them thinking through their contacts and thinking about, who was important for their work and how they went about having those contacts. And again, I can go into more details, and maybe if you have more questions, we can go into more details. But the main question of the questionnaire was first to ask people to reflect on who are the most important people for their work. So that was the main question of the whole questionnaire. It was very broad, so I didn't ask them who are the most important people for your work in Newcastle, in the Northeast, in the world. I left no boundaries to that. And I didn't even impose that would have been a business contact, because it's somebody important for your work. So some people put in their questionnaire their mom. But it's okay, because if it is important for your work, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Some people put a website, some people, put some weird sort of contacts in a way that you wouldn't expect it. But that's because I left this open, and I really wanted it to be more open than the standard questionnaires, giving categories of who you want to include. And I asked first them to reflect more broadly who is important for their work, and then to select out of that broader list 12 main contacts. They had 12 spaces they could fill in that were the main contacts and the main people important for their work. So those are the people that you saw in the map previously. So people were able to name up to 12 individuals that were important for their work. So this is very small, but just to give you an idea, one of the issues, of course, was always about getting a balance across sectors, and that I was very bad with. Meaning that I didn't have much control, of course, because I really wanted the more questionnaires I could get, the better it would have been for my data. So, of course, I ended up the visual artists were 80% of my sample, which is much higher than for, say, architects, which are just 4. But, I didn't want to, decide I wanted 4 for each, because I didn't thought it was useful. I really wanted to get as many as I could. So it wasn't balanced in terms of the kind of sector that were covered. And when I show you the data, then you will see that some groups are more represented than others. But there was some sort of balance in a way across the sector, because I ended up having 20 people working in the public sector, 40 in the private, and 30 in the non-voluntary sector, and 12 in education, and 29 freelancers. So in that respect, it was quite a good spread of different sectors in terms of public, private, and not-for-profit. It was quite interesting looking at the questionnaires. What you get, of course, you get the people who mention their mothers. You get people who use all of those 12 contacts. People that think, oh, I'm giving you all the most important people to work with. There were people that could only give me 3 and really commented that 3 are the only people I have that are important for my work. Not because they were lazy and didn't want to give me 12. So, so there was a range, of course, here. So people completely networked, and people that really just talk with their neighbor's studio. person, and that was it. That was their whole network. So that was quite interesting in that respect. One of the most interesting findings is that actually one of the main questions was, is this contact a professional contact, a social contact, or both? And this is quite interesting because, of course, half of the contacts are professional, but half of them are either social or both. So this is obviously something quite specific of the creative economy, this overlapping of your personal social relationship with your work relationship. And here again, just a quick data showing that, as I said, all the contacts could be from anywhere in the world and from any sector. So we ended up having that anyhow. Obviously, the local contacts, the Northeast contacts were quite high. So altogether 600 nodes, obviously including the one that we started with, were from the Northeast. The UK obviously was quite meaningful. And altogether, though, the European and world sort of wide dimension was quite smaller. So, of course, geography plays a role in networks, and this is, kind of emerging here as well. So, if we go into the key findings, I've articulated the findings in 5 topics, and in some of them you will see the social network analysis is really important and really useful. In others, I would argue that actually social network analysis is only useful with qualitative methods attached to it. So for instance, in the first point, actually, I quite argue that it's really hard with social network analysis to find multiple and overlapping role of networks. So it's really hard through a social network analysis questionnaire to understand how much of a network is about personal relationship, how about is it about funding, how much is it about markets and finding access to new customers, how much, the various motivation and layers underneath a network connection are really hard to explore. And you get the network connection, but you always wonder, so is it because of funding, or is it because of, that sort of information is really much more embedded within the network and within the qualitative materials, and with talking with people and understanding their explanation of that connection and why they connect with that person and how important that person is. So I would argue that, I wouldn't say that the social network analysis data are sort of powerful on their own, in some of these areas. I think they're very powerful when you've got also the qualitative material able to back up some of those motivation and dynamics, really. So, as I say, I'm going to go through 5 key sort of areas, really, of my findings. The role of networks, so why people use networks, the idea of the interconnection between public, private, and not-for-profit, the role played by public and not-for-profit sector, in particular as connectors of the overall creative economy, the connection within and across networks, and finally the evolution, so how networks change over time. So the first point, as I say, is about the multiple role of networks. And as I said, this is something that I found very hard to capture through the social network analysis. And although it was hard to capture in the social network analysis sense, it was very easy to capture it from talking with people. So people describe network as being a key access to the market. So the only way in which they could sell their work is by going out, talking with people, telling them what they were doing, and sort of explaining and finding some other person who would recommend them. So they were the key way in which they would make a living out of their art of creative practice. Lots of people use network as a form of knowledge exchange and professional career development. So here you would find early career, people just started as artists, telling you that the important thing is talking with people who are already in the sector, been there for 5 years. They can give you some guidelines, they can give you an advice or something. Network as funding structure, lots of these artists sort of using networks to obtain some support from a foundation, from a public agency, from the local city council. So the ability to talk with the right people would give you access to some support or some sort of infrastructure. Lots of people using the network as a social and informal infrastructure, and some artists maybe live even in rural conditions, or even some craft person, usually sort of explaining that actually being an artist or a craft person is a very solitary work. You would be in your studio for 8 hours on your own, and you really needed to go to the network event to be able to talk with people, share thoughts, share ideas, and just support each other. So much more of a social, connection than anything to do with business, really. And also as a business infrastructure, and quite a lot of differences here. Some sectors, very business networked, media, architecture, design. Some other sector like visual arts, very much more distant from the business network and much more into the social, interactive sort of network, friendly network. But very much the important thing though was emerging was that people were not really naive about it. They knew exactly how to play their networks. They knew exactly where to go if they needed the business advice or the funding, or which network to use for their personal support, or which networks to go and use for something else. So they could, go in and out of networks as it was, useful to them, and they were using it in a very clever way most of the time. So these are some quotes that will really sort of highlight some of the things I've just been saying. So this person saying, take somebody like Nick, all his work and sales are just through words of mouth, through getting himself everywhere, talking to everybody, being involved in everything. That's pretty much 100% of his work. So that's how this designer was getting work, just talking with everybody. So the idea that networks bring you your income, basically. Oh, this idea, there was quite a lot of network structures that were built and sort of promoted by these creative themselves. So Designed and Made was a network of designers in the region, and this designer involved in the network says, unless you have something like Designed and Made, other regions, the rest of the UK and the world won't know about the Northeast and what is going on in here. So the network being a promotional tool. And this other artist, which is based at the National Glass Center, so she's part of the network, which is the studios in the National Glass Center, says, commissions are passed on to me from the National Glass Center, from other artists, because they cannot do the job. And it's really important. It's really about being in the right place, in the right time, and at the same time, when I cannot do a job, I try and pass it on to other colleagues. So again, this idea that if you work together, if you pass contacts, then you will benefit from the network further. And as I said, these network structures were really common and were really almost a strategy for different people in different sectors to try and emerge and collaborate and work together. So Designed and Made was a network of designers. Cohesion was the network of glass artists in the region. The Aurora Project was a rural network of craft maker, network artists, another rural network of artists, a design association, network of designers. So every sector had its own gathering, its own network. Sometimes these organizations were funded by the public sector, like as a sort of city council initiative or arts council initiative. Sometimes they were just really the people, the artists, the designer coming together informally and meeting, having a website maybe. So there were different level of formality there as well. And as I said, through this network, which most of them are really grassroots, so meaning they were developed by the artists themselves to start with. It could really be easy to see how artists wanted to create network for themselves. They didn't want to join another business network that was already out there for any generic business. They really wanted to have a place for themselves. So this, for instance, this artist saying, because it's arts-led, we're making it what we need. Coming from us is going to be more relevant than if it was coming from people in the public sector who have the best intention, but they don't work in the sector. They don't exactly know what we need. So this is an explanation of why the creative network run by creative was much more powerful than other network structure. But also this mission that, this is a person from a new media company, so this is a mission that actually networking needed to be done informally. You couldn't, engineer networking. You couldn't just say, take this amount of people, put it in that room and networking will happen. But it was very much about, meeting somebody in the corridor, have a coffee, you chat in the bar after a gig, and that's kind of how I want it to be, because if you sit down and formally network, culture that doesn't fit comfortably with the kind of people that tend to do the job. So this idea, you need to be much more spontaneous. So if we go, so this was the first point I showed, was really about based on the qualitative really sort of analysis. But if we go instead into looking at how we understand the relationship between private, public and not-for-profit, what I found is that here social network analysis is a much more powerful tool than the accounts that people give. Because of course I've got plenty of accounts of people telling me that they work with the private and public sector, but I didn't understand the size of the amount of connection going on. So this was just a sort of global view analysis. So the nodes in the yellow are the nodes who are people in the private sector, the nodes in green are public, and the red is the not-for-profit sector. And what you see, these numbers are the number of connections that go in that direction, basically. So this is a summary. So you've got a number of 137 people in the private sector naming somebody in the public sector as one of their contacts, one of these important people for their work. So this is a very powerful representation because it really tells you, the kind of, intertwined sort of landscape that you've got there. And what you have, as you can see, some of them, you might expect, for instance, I was quite surprised that there are so many people in the private sector naming people in the public sector as important. I would have expected almost the contrary. But also as well, the fact that you can see that the not-for-profit sector, a large amount of people saying the public is important, which seems quite obvious, of course, the not-for-profit relying on public funding and other structure. But still, they also have 50 contacts in the private sector they name as important. So this sort of interconnection is really clear there and is quite powerful. But again, a quote to try and explain also why that is. Why does it happen like that? And this is really interesting. Somebody talk you from a voluntary organization saying the same people are doing everything and moving around. For example, as people move in their careers, so people might move from the university, then they start their own theater company, then they move to Live, which is an important theater, then move to North Stage, another important theater. People move in and out of the Arts Council because you have a big overview and you want to move on, then they come back to basic, they go to work in an organization before they were serving. You see the same people, but they're not doing the same job that we're doing the last time. Everybody told me that Newcastle and the Northeast is a village. But that's very much sort of the kind of career structure of some of these creative practitioners. So there isn't, if you are a designer, there isn't an idea that you have to be a designer in the private sector. You can be a designer for a public company, you can be a designer in a not-for-profit organization, you can be a freelancer for a certain period. So the way your career moves as well allows you to build this network that really go beyond the sector itself and are much broader. After, of course, one of the main questions with a network is who is important in the network. So this is the in-degree partition. So it's just pulling out the nodes, which are the nodes that were most named within the network. And again, obviously, who's named depends very much on the sample. So it's not about thinking, is this person important or not? What was really important to me is finding out that actually the people who were the one most named are all people which are either in the public, in the public sector or in the not-for-profit sector. So public is green, red is not-for-profit sector. There's only one node, which is a private person. So what is really interesting here is just not saying that there is an intertwined relationship between the three sectors, but actually the public and not-for-profit sector function almost as a structure of brokerage. So all of these people relying on these people and sort of these people being able to act, as the people that have got more connection and can bring a sort of overview, across the sector. So here the role of the public and not-for-profit sector is really highlighted even further. And in fact, if you look at the list of the people who were most named, one of the interesting things is the person which is most named, somebody at the university, a lecturer. So again, somebody within the sector, involved in the sector from a different standing position. And so we got people in the Arts Council, people in the City Council, people in community arts organization. So these people are really important to keep together the network. And this is very much what I just said in the quotes. So this person saying, actually, these people can provide opportunities for people to meet, formally, informally. They can provide some sort of marriage bureau. So the idea they can match people together. And these people saying, I go from organic networks into structural network, and I do a bit of both. So again, the idea that you can play around with networks and make them relevant to yourself. The other question was very much about who is more interconnected with each other, and this was a key core analysis. And it wasn't very meaningful in reference to the fact that, of course, again, it depended very much on the sample, which wasn't balanced to start with. But I could find most interconnected the glass network, which is Northeast is famous for glass. The visual arts network, I had more visual artists, so obviously it's proven that they are more connected. And the writing network, another important network. So actually, the people I mapped the most showed to be more connected. So you could see the cluster basically emerging as well. But if you then look and take the sectors, so for instance, this is architecture, this is film, this is the public sector. So you could see that, of course, there were interconnections across sector, but not as many as networks within the sector. So it's a sort of part analysis. And these ideally would have wanted a balanced sample to be able to do any more questioning, but it's not. But it still is interesting to see that there are connections across sectors, because they sort of highlight the idea that it's not just clustering of people who work together, it's clustering of people who work across the sectors as well. And finally, the last point was very much about the evolution of network, which again is the thing that is very difficult to capture. On all those relations, the people named, I asked them to tell me when the relationship started. So if they had known that person for 10 years, 20 years, or how long. So from that data, I could sort of trace some long-term relationship, some mid-range relationship, and a lot more connection happening towards 2006, which is the period where there is a regeneration in Newcastle. There's a lot of cultural investment. But as I said, this is obviously just referring to those specific connections that were named, so it's not an overview, obviously, of the whole networks taking place in that context. But obviously, the thing that is really hard to capture is how networks change. And here, I think the qualitative work is much more interesting, because, for instance, this person telling me, the fact that they had a network to start with, but then it became more professional, bigger scale, and, which is good. But I enjoyed meeting my friends, so it really killed the social side. So the big organization coming in and taking over the small organization and say, you're not doing it right, this is what you want. Well, in fact, it was the last thing we wanted, to be honest. It's a shame, because the networks are not there anymore. So the idea that networks change, and obviously the function of those organizations change, and so people sometimes leave networks, starts other networks, a network becomes useless for something. So it's really important to capture that evolution, and I think social network analysis is really hard, to capture that sort of evolution in reference to specific nodes. So I'm down to the conclusions. So some quick conclusions which are in reference strongly to the methodology, and then I've got some very broad conclusions on the findings of the research. So the methodology, defining the nodes and boundaries is really hard, and I left them quite open because I really wanted to try to capture the broader range of interconnection. But I think a lot of social network analysis research tends to capture those boundaries very tightly, and therefore is the definition of your network that really defines what you find, rather than the network being that shape, which is sometimes something I've got a problem, like when you talk about clusters. Yeah, of course, if you interview just the people which are part of that local cluster and you just ask about their own connection with each other, of course you're capturing a cluster, because you're not capturing anything else. So it's about how you define those nodes and how those nodes define what you find at the end. And in particular, this opposition by the complete networks and individual networks. I think complete networks are interesting, but they're very fictional. They're not the reality. We don't have complete networks in reality. What we have is a big sum of individual networks, which are much more challenging to study, but they're much more realistic. They reflect what each of us experience every day, which is an individual network. Of course, there is an ethical issue, which we're all aware about probably. And I think, the problem I really had is to capture with social network analysis this idea of the multi-layer relationship. It was really hard to define what network was just funding network, what network was just social network, what network was just business network. It was such a mix. It was really hard to capture that. And as I argue, I don't think mapping is enough. You really need to supplement that with this qualitative material and qualitative information. But hopefully, all of those data have convinced you that if you want to look at the creative cities, a creative context, you really need to adopt a network approach. You shouldn't just start saying, I'm going to start mapping the creative economy, or I'm going to start looking at regeneration. You really need to look at how things come together into a specific context and what kind of networks are formed. And in particular, I think, a lot of research on the creative economy has completely ignored the role of public and not-for-profit sector, because the sort of, it's not creative economy, the creative industries are the creative economy. Well, if you take out those two, actually my network completely falls apart. So the network falls apart, but also you don't really understand what kind of access to resources and knowledge these people have, so you don't really understand how the local system works if you're not also including those two sectors. And that's it.